Israel sends more ground troops into Gaza, having entered, quote, the second phase of the war. Iran says Israel has crossed the red lines. Having returned home from Saudi Arabia and Qatar, President Yoon says the billions of dollars worth of investment pledges made during the trips will help rev up the economy in electric cars and construction, among other key areas. At the National Assembly, lawmakers across the aisle remember the deadly crowd crush in Itaewon 1 year ago, calling for change to improve safety. It's October 30th, 2023. This is News Center. Good evening. Thank you for joining us. I'm Yoon Min. Tensions are rising in Gaza. The Israeli Defense Force continues expanding its ground offensive against Hamas there, having entered what it calls the second phase of the war. Iran says Israel has crossed the red lines, while U.S. President Joe Biden urges Israel to prioritize the saving of civilian lives. Lee Soo-jin starts us off.
Israel is expanding its ground operations despite the escalating death toll in Gaza. According to Palestinian media on early Monday, Israeli troops bombarded the Strip with fierce air and artillery strikes. The airstrikes reportedly hit areas near Gaza City's hospitals, and Palestinian and Israeli militants also clashed in a border area east of Khan Yunis in the enclave's south. This comes just hours after Israel released images of battle tanks on the west coast of the Gaza Strip, largely seen as a potential move to surround Gaza's main city. The Israeli military said that it has struck 600 militant targets over the past few days, saying in a statement that IDF troops killed dozens of terrorists who barricade themselves in buildings and tunnels. The airstrikes are part of what Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu called the second stage of its retaliatory assault against Hamas.
The war inside the Gaza Strip will be long and difficult, and we are ready for it.
With Israel continuing air raids on Gaza, Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi renewed threats against the country on Sunday, saying that it had crossed the red line in Gaza, which may force everyone to take action, hinting at the possibility of Tehran getting involved in the conflict. Taking to social media, President Raisi said the U.S. told Iran not to do anything, but Washington continues to give widespread support to Israel. Meanwhile, calls for a humanitarian ceasefire continue to grow as the death toll mounts. According to the White House on Sunday, U.S. President Joe Biden told Netanyahu that Israel should conduct its operations in Gaza in a manner consistent with international humanitarian law that prioritizes the protection of civilians, in their first phone call since the Israeli military expanded its ground operations in Gaza on Friday. According to Gaza's health ministry, the death toll among Palestinians passed 8,000, mostly women and children, since armed conflict began on October 7th, while 1,400 have been killed on the Israeli side, most of them being civilians. Lee Soo-jin, Arirang News.
In other news, President Yoon and Japanese Prime Minister Kishida have been recognized by the John F. Kennedy Foundation for their courage in mending bilateral ties and strengthening three-way cooperation with the U.S. to promote regional peace. Woo Soo-young has more.
President Yoon Suk-yeol and Prime Minister Fumio Kishida pledged more courageous efforts to pursue peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific region after they jointly received a prize for their push to bolster trilateral cooperation with the United States. The John F. Kennedy Foundation held a ceremony Sunday, with the South Korean and Japanese leaders awarded as special recipients of the International Profile and Courage Award for working to improve bilateral ties, despite domestic opposition arising from historical issues. In particular, the foundation said Yoon began working towards rapprochement with Japan shortly after his election in March last year, adding that the two leaders have since built up a strong personal relationship with an exchange of visits between Seoul and Tokyo. It said such courage to choose a more hopeful future led to a historic level of trilateral cooperation with the US at their Camp David summit. The August summit produced key documents that set out a new framework for dialogue and coordination on military responses to North Korea's provocations and broader regional security, as well as economic issues and humanitarian projects in the Indo-Pacific. Accepting the honor in a video message, the South Korean leader said he was privileged to be awarded with his dear friend Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, promising even greater efforts to show courage based on utter sacrifice and dedication.
I know that this award is a reminder of my solemn duty, a profound sense of responsibility placed upon the Republic of Korea, the United States, and Japan to promote freedom and prosperity around the world by standing together in solidarity.
Yoon said as an English learner in high school, he was inspired by President Kennedy's values and worldview, which drove his push for innovation and reform, which led to social progress and scientific achievement. He mentioned the former US leader's New Frontier speech in 1960, which outlined his bold vision for the future while describing the many challenges facing America. Also in a video message, Prime Minister Kishida said he would work to open a new era in Korean-Japan relations based on his friendship with and trust of President Yoon, and that with the US, the three Pacific powers would contribute to peace and stability in the region. Previous recipients of the Courage Award include Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky last year, Presidents Barack Obama and George W. Bush, and former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan. Oh Si-young, Arirang News.
President Yoon presided over a cabinet meeting earlier today and spoke about his recent trip to the Middle East, pension reform, and bills that need to be passed by the National Assembly. As our Kim Do-yeon reports, they all had one thing in common. They were linked to the livelihood of the people.
President Yoon Suk-yeol showed confidence on his trip to the Middle East last week that what's been accomplished will boost the domestic economy and improve the people's livelihoods. This, as on Monday he presided over a cabinet meeting and cited 63 MOUs and deals made in Saudi and Qatar worth around $20 billion.
이런 대규모 수출과 수주는 양질의 일자리 창출을 통해 경제와 민생에 활기를 불어넣을 것입니다.
He also referred to his trip to the UAE earlier this year, saying that his completed state visits to all three big Middle East economies and jobs have already been created from his trip to the Emirates, specifically on smart farms. Saying that South Korea inadvertently relies on exports, he promised to work harder to expand the horizons for the nation's companies and provide smaller firms opportunities to gain markets overseas.
정상 순방 외교는 우리 국민과 기업의 글로벌 시장 개척을 돕는 최적의 플랫폼입니다. 지금까지 저의 해외 순방에 동행한 경제사절단은 중소 중견기업이 80% 가까이 차지합니다.
He also emphasized the importance of keeping the domestic business atmosphere aligned with international standards for local companies to gain access to overseas markets, calling for relevant ministries to make sure of this. In the meantime, President Yoon also took time to address the government's efforts towards pension reform, as the government's new plan on pension system operation has passed the cabinet meeting and has been submitted to the National Assembly. Pension system is one of Yoon's three reform targets, along with labor and education. President Yoon explained that pension reform will not be just based on numbers and data. Instead, he will get a solid public consensus, vowing that he won't put political gains first.
저는 지난 대선 시에 제가 대통령이 되면 과거 정부들과 달리 연금 개혁에 대한 초당적 합의가 도출될 수 있도록 행정부가 과학적 근거와 국민 의견 조사, 선택 방안의 제시 등을 철저히 준비하고 적극 나서겠다고 약속드린 바 있습니다. 이 약속은 반드시 지킬 것입니다.
In the meantime, he also addressed yet-to-be-passed bills at the National Assembly that directly impact the livelihoods of the people. These include revisions to the Act on the Aggravated Punishment of Specific Economic Crimes, an effort to prevent jeonse fraud, as a rising number of young Koreans getting caught up in the rental deposit scam has spurred national anger. It's also notable that the request comes a day before Yoon's expected speech at the National Assembly on the government's budget for next year. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
Over at the National Assembly, lawmakers gathered this afternoon along with family members of the victims of the Itaewon crowd crush disaster to remember those who perished 1 year ago. Assembly Speaker Kim Jin-pyo said it was important to reflect on whether the country has fulfilled its duty to protect the lives and safety of the people. Ruling People Power Party floor leader Yoon noted that the National Assembly needed to refrain from political battles and come up with effective measures to prevent the repetition of any such disaster. Meanwhile, main opposition Democratic Party floor leader Hong Ik-pyo called for a united effort to pass a DP-led special bill aimed at reinvestigating the incident. The disaster claimed the lives of 159 people celebrating Halloween in Itaewon. South Korea is seeing a widening gap in its gross national income with a group of 7 countries because of a weakening national currency and a slowing economy. Moon explains.
The gap between South Korea's gross national income and that of G7 countries is growing bigger on the back of the weakening Korean won and slow economic growth. According to data released by the Bank of Korea on Monday, the country's gross national income per capita by the World Bank's latest measurements for 2022 came to $35,990. GNI per capita is an important economic metric as it represents national income. Of the G7 countries, the top 7 economies in the world, Italy had the lowest GNI per capita at just under $37,000, but this is still over $1,700 more than South Korea. Back in 2020, South Korea's GNI per capita ranked above Italy's by $610, the first time in history that the country had recorded such a feat. However, this was temporary as Italy recorded a 9% decline in economic growth due to the effects of COVID-19. The following year, in 2021, Italy's GNI per capita rose by over $1,000. When compared to the United States, which ranks first among G7 countries in terms of GNI per capita, the gap widened with the US figure at around $40,000. The growing gap has been attributed to the weakening Korean won as well as differences in economic growth. According to the Bank of Korea's economic statistics system, the Korean won depreciated by around 13% in 2022 compared to 2021, when comparing the average $1 exchange rates throughout the year. While the euro, which is used in Italy, also fell against the greenback, the average euro-dollar exchange rate throughout 2022 was around 11% lower than the previous year, showing that the decline of its currency was weaker than that of the Korean won. As for economic growth, Italy's gross domestic product grew by 3.7% last year. This is more than 1 percentage point higher than South Korea's GDP for the same period, which was recorded at 2.6%. Whether South Korea can overtake Italy once again this year is dependent on GDP growth, as the exchange rate is said to be unlikely to recover within the next few months. The South Korean government has maintained its growth projection of 1.4% for the year, while Italy has reduced its outlook from 1% to 0.8%. Moon, Arirang News.
South Korea is becoming more of a cultural powerhouse these days as K-pop and other K-content gain global fandom and popularity. And the nation's new culture minister, Yoon says he'll make Korean culture more accessible, both at home and abroad. Our culture correspondent Song Yoo-jin tells us what he has in mind for key cultural initiatives.
It's been a busy 3 weeks for South Korea's new Minister of Culture, Sports and Tourism, Yoon. Since taking office earlier this month, he's been crisscrossing provinces, engaging with industry officials. This is his second term as culture minister, having previously served from 2008 to 2011. Back in the role, Yoo says he will make Korean culture more accessible both domestically and on the global stage. On the domestic front, he's prioritizing the transformation of regions outside Seoul into vibrant cultural hubs. This involves establishing more state-run performing arts companies and what's called the Local 100 project, which spotlights 100 landmarks, cultural assets, and artisans.
We aim to engage with people who are eager to participate in this project, enabling them to immerse themselves in the unique culture, cuisine, and products of each region. This initiative is expected to breathe new life into regions outside the capital.
Globally, Minister Yu envisions enhancing the competitiveness of Korean content by providing support for content creators to safeguard their intellectual property rights, as well as allocating 1.7 trillion Korean won, or $1.3 billion for content creation next year. When asked about his top priority, his answer was amending the Copyright Act.
The revision should take into account the interests of content creators, producers, streaming services, and other involved stakeholders. I'll constantly engage, discuss, and communicate with these parties.
Based on these, the Culture Ministry will lay out detailed policies for each sector by the end of this year. 송유진, Arirang News.
It's been over a year since South Korea launched its digital platform government, which aims for more user-friendly administrative services. Our business correspondent Shin Ha-young spoke with the head of the Presidential Committee on the Digital Platform Government to explore what's been achieved and what still needs to be done.
Enabling people to receive services tailored to their needs by integrating information and data across the private and public sectors. This is what the Yoon administration has been focusing on through the Digital Platform Government Initiative, or DPG. First launched in September last year, a Presidential Committee on the Digital Platform Government spent its first year creating an action plan.
The claiming process for actual medical expenses insurance will be simplified. Policyholders had to visit hospitals to obtain related documents and submit them to the insurance company. Similarly, for export companies, the process of applying for trade financing has been simplified by enabling electronic submission of documents from the Korea Customs Service to financial institutions.
These efforts have extended abroad. During President Yoon's state visit to the Middle East last week, South Korean tech giant Naver struck a deal with the Saudi Arabian government to create a digital twin platform, a virtual geospatial model of the real world for urban planning and management in 5 Saudi cities.
Establishing and disseminating a digital twin is part of the Digital Platform Government's plan. The latest deal is the outcome of cooperation between the government and a private company. It is meaningful as it is the first export case of the Digital Platform Government.
In terms of digital infrastructure, Ko says South Korea is a global powerhouse. But he thinks the country falls short in utilizing digital technology, which is the reason for creating the world's first use case of hyperscale AI across government departments.
We are creating a hyperscale AI for the government using refined data and reinforcement learning from human feedback, specifically from public officials. This can be used for data analysis and policymaking and addressing social welfare issues. It can be also used to prevent accidents like the Itaewon tragedy by analyzing traffic data to proactively identify potential risks in densely populated areas.
Last September, the South Korean government published what it calls the Digital Bill of Rights. Ko says that the DPG and the Digital Bill of Rights are inseparable.
The Digital Platform Government plans to demonstrate the Digital Bill of Rights, focusing on improving people's welfare and rights. To alleviate concerns about misusing personal information, we'll establish a system that enables citizens to transparently verify how and where their data is shared and utilized within the government.
Under the theme of government innovation with the Digital Platform Government, there will be an exhibition in November showcasing the achievements of the DPG and demonstrating how it'll shape the future of the government. Shin Ha-young, Arirang News.
It's time to take a look at what's been happening in the world of sports. For that, we have our sports editor, Paul Neat, joining us in the studio. Evening, Paul.
Hello there.
Let's start with K-League football. Ulsan Hyundai are champions again?
Yes, back-to-back titles now for Ulsan Hyundai for the first time in their history as well. But a 2-0 win over Daegu FC on Sunday sealed the title for Ulsan, with 3 games still to play this season, faster than last season when they won it on the penultimate day of the campaign. Kim Min-hyuk broke the deadlock on 69 minutes before Jang Si-young made it 2-0 late on. Pohang Steelers, drawing with Jeonbuk Hyundai Motors early on Saturday, opened the door for Ulsan to clinch their second title in a row. Prior to last year, Ulsan had gone 17 years without winning the K-League, but have now joined an elite group of clubs to win the league in consecutive seasons, those being Songnam, Suwon Blue Wings and Jeonbuk. Ulsan are led by South Korean football legend Hong Myung-bo. The Hwarangi have won both of their last 2 titles under his leadership.
And sticking with football, it provided a good weekend for South Koreans in Europe.
Yeah, starting on Friday with a goal for Son Heung-min. He scored in Tottenham's 2-1 away win over Crystal Palace in the Premier League, making it 2-0 on 66 minutes, with what turned out to be the winning goal. From just over 6 yards out, Son swept home a Brennan Johnson cutback for his 8th goal of the season in just 10 matches. Son only managed to score 10 in the whole of last season. The win, though, was Tottenham's 4th in a row and keeps them top of the table, unbeaten and 2 points clear of Manchester City. Elsewhere in Europe, Lee Kang-in got an assist in Paris Saint-Germain's 3-2 Ligue 1 win over Brest, teeing up Kylian Mbappe in the 28th minute. This after scoring in the Champions League against AC Milan just a few days before. And Hwang Hee-chan continued his fine start to the season, scoring a point-securing equaliser in a 2-2 Premier League draw for Wolves against Newcastle. It was his 6th goal of the season. And Hwang Hee-jo scored his first goal for Norwich City, opening the scoring for the Canaries in a 3-1 loss to Sunderland in the Championship, the English second tier.
And moving on to short track speed skating, more ISU World Cup medals for Korea.
Yes, that's right, including Kim Gon-woo, who won gold in the 1500 metres yet again. Kim on Sunday in Montreal, Canada, finished first in the second men's 1500 metres final. He clocked in at 2 minutes 20.294 seconds. Fellow Korean Park Ji-won won silver. Kim Gon-woo also won gold in the men's 1,000 metres, and there were also 2 golds for So Hui-min, one in the women's 1,000 metres and one in the 3,000 metre relay, along with Kim Gi-lee, Shim Seok-hee and Park Ji-won, the other one. Overall, South Korea finished with 4 gold, 4 silver and 3 bronze. Up next is the ISU 4 continents in Quebec from November 3rd to the 5th.
And finally, the Asian Para Games concluded over the weekend. How did Team Korea do?
They did very well. They finished 4th overall in the medal rankings, and they returned home on Sunday after winning 30 gold medals, 33 silver and 40 bronze from 18 different sports. And they returned to a hero's welcome after clinching that 4th place, which was the target from the beginning, despite bowling not being part of the games this time around, a sport that earned Team Korea 12 medals last time. But most of Korea's medals came in badminton, winning 28 in total, 9 gold, 5 silver and 14 bronze. The Para Games saw over 30,000 athletes from 44 countries compete in 22 disciplines. China finished first, Iran second and Japan third. But there were first medals in the Asian Games for Kyrgyzstan, Nepal and Yemen. Each won 1 each.
Good to hear. Thanks for that. See you next week.
Thank you. See you.
Conditions will be warmer than the seasonal norms tomorrow. For eastern regions where a high-pressure system is taking over, temperatures will be especially warm. Places like Gyeongju will be 7 degrees higher than the seasonal average, with highs of 25 degrees Celsius. With the rise in daytime readings, temperature gaps will also widen as well. Please be extra careful not to catch a cold. In the meantime, some mountainous regions have reached their peak of fall foliage, but there are some areas where fall foliage has just begun. Places like Woraksan and Mudungsan have just started to change their colors. Fall foliage is forecast to last until the first week of November, so enjoy the beautiful colors of autumn until then. As for the readings, I'll be starting off at 13 degrees. Some inland regions will see lows falling into single figures. Daytime conditions will be much warmer. Seoul will get up to 20 degrees, Daejeon 21, Daegu and Busan will be topping out at 23 degrees. On Wednesday, the Seoul metropolitan area and Gangwon-do province will see a round of showers. Conditions will stay warmer than the seasonal norms for the remainder of the week. It's all for now, and here are the weather conditions around the world.
That is News Center for tonight. Thank you for watching. A panel session coming up.
I'm live. 저를 도와주시는 분들이
저희와 함께 해주시는 세션분들
아무리 봐도 없지. 펜션 같은데 이런 거 아무도 안 하는 거고.
좋아요.
입니다. 하나 스탠바이. 하나 스타트.
Hello, I'm Yoon Müller, Ambassador of Slovenia to the Republic of Korea. Right now, I see Korea shining in the world. Korea has many strengths, and the global presence is already here. Slovenia will continue to establish the presence in the international scene. This is also one of the reasons why we opened the embassy in Korea last year. I always thank Arirang TV for playing a big role in promoting Korean information to the world so that many people can access Korean content and get to know all aspects of Korean culture. I hope that people around the world will continue to communicate and sympathize with Korea. Resonating the world, Arirang.
Today, we'll travel back to Korea in the 1970s.
Loved and watched around the world. We want to make more animations to reach more children. traveling time and space, developing adventure and curiosity, infinite creativity and hope. We want our children to grow up to be happy. K-animation, watched by children all around the world. So that joy can be felt when our animation is watched. This is the reason we make animation and share with the world. K-animation, befriending children all over the world.
하나, 둘, 셋.
Hey, Mr. Cupid, who's mine? Make sure you listen to what I say. I may be stupid or quite naive.
끝없이 쏟아지는 포토스팟. 휴대폰 한 대로 감당할 수 있겠니?
Arrow straight through my heart.
한국에 오면 먹어야죠. 먹어도 끝이 없는 나라. 감당할 수 있겠니?
Hello everyone, it's Monday and you're watching Within the Frame. I'm Kim Boo-kyung. The number of sex offenders and the rate of reoffense in South Korea have both been on a continuous rise. To tackle this, the Ministry of Justice has come up with a new draft of the Korean version of Jessica's Law, designating specific places where high-risk sex offenders are able to live. Some agree with the new draft, saying people would no longer have to be fearful that a convicted sex offender will move into their district. Some disagree, saying it will violate their rights of residence and will punish them twice. What are the details of this new draft and what do experts think the pros and cons are? For more on this, we have invited Professor Song Se-ryun from Kyung University Law School. Welcome, Professor Song.
Thanks for inviting me. Thank you.
Thank you for being with us. And we also have Professor Lee Yeon from Handong International Law School. Good to see you, Professor Lee.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Now, Professor Lee, first question. Before we talk about the Justice Ministry's new draft, I would like to tap into where this law originated. The law is being called the Korean version of the Jessica Bill. How did this Jessica Bill get enacted in the U.S. and what does it say?
Well, this was a very tragic case in 2005 where there was a 9-year-old girl in Florida who was abducted by a convicted sex felon. And so in this particular case, she was abducted, she was kidnapped, and then, violated, and then eventually killed. And about less than a month later, her remains were found in a bag. And it really caused a lot of shock to the community in Florida about what happened to her, because this was a registered sex offender that committed these acts. And so her father, in this case, Jessica's father, Jessica Lunsford, her father then pushed for a bill within Florida to make sure that these kinds of events don't happen again, where you have a registered sex offender who was living in the area who then was able to then commit this crime again in such a violent way. And so Jessica's Law basically was an initiative made by this father, concerned father, who then pushed it through the Florida bill as a law. But basically what it means is, in these kinds of contexts, is there's a limitation in terms of where particular sex offenders can live. So particularly in terms of the distance that you may be from a place where children are gathering. So for instance, at a school. So some states, like Florida, have said, within 2,000 feet, a sex offender may not live in terms of their residence. As well as mandating certain kinds of penalties for sex offenders in this situation. So minimum of 25 years in the certain circumstances if you are convicted of a similar crime. There's also notification requirements to local institutions like school boards and other places where there may be children around. So this law was first enacted in Florida and in many states around the United States, then copied this law, and then you had different versions of Jessica's laws in many states in the United States.
All right, I see. So it includes measures restricting sex offenders from living near schools and other places where students could be around. Now, Professor Song, the ministry's draft certainly has differences from the U.S. But before that, let's discuss the reason why the Justice Ministry came up with this law. I hear it is because of an increasing number of sex offenses. How serious is this?
Well, if the report is right, it's pretty serious. There has been a steady and also pretty quick increase in the conviction of the sexual offenses. I think the one lawmaker mentioned that in the last 5 years, it leaped into tenfold of convictions. But I think you have to kind of take into consideration that because of the high-profile cases, not to the Jessica Lunsford case degree, but we have had a lot of news articles and instances where public are now and put a notice that this is becoming a dangerous environment. So there has been some enactment or the expansion of the law, especially, for example, in the 2020, the statutory rape range was expanded, previously 13 years old, but now in many cases you can get punished for violating 16-year-olds. But also 2021, the so-called nth room scandals, that digital offenses were made into the law for prevention. So because of those laws, there are more acts to punish at this point. So that partly explains the increase, in a rapid increase. But I think you cannot deny that there has been some increases in this area. And also society's mood is that we have to be tough on crime because not only the sexual offenses, but the drug offenses and other violent crimes is happening on the streets. So those things kind of conspire to make a right environment where we have to act as a society and enact laws to counter the occurrences of these crimes.
Right. It's quite unfortunate to see how the number of sex offenses is continuously increasing. Well, Professor Lee, let's now delve deeper into the details. What does Korean version of the Jessica bill mandate, and how is it different from Washington's?
Right. So as I mentioned before, the Jessica's law is a state law-based provision. So there's no federal law in the United States that's similar in nature. But with respect to sort of the differences and similarities, naturally, when it comes to Jessica's law in the United States, one of the basic provisions is mandated prison terms. So as I mentioned before, 25-year minimum prison term for raping a child under the age of 13, and there will be 15 years for attempted rape in those cases. But the big issue, I think the big thing that is, I think, unique about Jessica's law is the questions about where someone can live. So as I mentioned, in the United States, it varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but some places in the United States say even that you cannot be within 500 feet of a place such as a school, a place where children gather regularly, daycare center, for instance. It goes from 500 feet in some jurisdictions to 2,000 feet in others. Now, in the Korean context, however, the one thing that I think it stands out really, particularly in terms of difference, is while there is significant penalties for punishment with respect to sex offenders, the biggest thing I think in terms of difference will be the mandated sort of government-run facilities that registered sex offenders may have to live in, as opposed to, for example, living in their own personal homes. A number of the government is proposing that in certain cases where there's extreme situations where there are repeated felons, let's say you've committed sex crimes up to 3 times, you may have to then be in a government-run facility and designated in a place where you can only stay there and not live in your own personal residence. Also, this is not particularly related to the specific Jessica's law, but as part of the proposal of changes that may be done to these regulations, there's also a mandate maybe for chemical castration for very serious child sex offenders. And so in combination of those things, you see very big differences, particularly in relationship to where one can live, but also with respect to the kind of treatments and that are available to put against sex offenders in these circumstances. So that's, of course, a very big difference than, let's say, what happens in the United States with these laws.
All right, so we can see significant difference between Washington's and the Korea's. Well, Professor Song, we are now going to take a look at the pros and cons. Those who agree with this new legislature say people would not have to worry about sex offenders released from prison, as they would live in state-designated facilities where their movement can be controlled more easily than just having them wear electronic anklets. Could you elaborate more on the beliefs of those who agree with this new law?
Right. Well, this kind of laws actually will turn out to be a balancing act between the state's interests to protect the public and the individual rights that even those the offenders have. Now, we, as Professor Lee has explained, these kind of laws kind of put into different buckets of what to do with the sex offenders. So there are tough sentences to begin with, stricter parole control standards, and chemical castration, as Professor Lee mentioned. And also, there's a restriction on where they live. And in Korea's case, the draft puts in a designated area. So it comes out to be, well, this is a draft stage, but it'll come out to be a kind of a different combination of these facts. Now, those people who are proponents and the supporters of this kind of legislation are obviously those who think that tougher crime prevention is the way to go as a society. So they would look at each buckets and say, well, we do need the tougher sentences and also stricter parole control and where they live. And they will maybe not, they're worried less about their constitutional rights, and especially their freedom to move and to choose to a place where they want to put their home. So I think that where that the combination and also where that balance comes out to be, I think the proponents would be pretty pushing hard that this is right combination for Korea under the circumstances.
Right. So this is the supporters' point of view. Now, Professor Lee, let's take a look at some of the concerns regarding this new law as well. Some experts say this could be a violation of Korea's constitution as it excessively restricts sex offenders' freedom of residence. What is this about?
Right. So as Professor Song mentioned, this is, of course, a balancing between the rights of the public with respect to safety, public safety, and then the question, of course, individual rights of those who are convicted. So in this case, as referenced earlier, we're talking specifically about Article 14 of the Korean Constitution, which states that all citizens shall enjoy freedom of residence and the right to move freely or at will. And so of course, if the government is going to impose this particular kind of I guess, punishment or sort of this sort of remedy for this problem of recidivism, that basically these sex offenders may and will commit crimes again, then having them at designated government-run facilities will then potentially, of course, be a limit on their freedom of choosing where to live. And so the Constitution doesn't make any distinction between whether you're convicted or not convicted, right? This applies to everyone, whether you're a criminal or not. So you have a constitutional right. And so in other jurisdictions, like, let's say, I'll give you an example. In California, this issue came up where you had Jessica's Law and you had restrictions on where certain people could live in terms of within certain places. And so what they found out was a lot of these sex offenders could only live in very limited areas because there were lots of schools, daycare centers, and therefore the question of the constitutionality of the law came into place. And so in that particular instance in California, that particular provision about limiting where one could live was actually struck down in California. Now, it's been upheld in other jurisdictions, but that should give you some indication that this could be an issue as to the constitutionality of that particular provision as it relates to the limitations on the freedom of movement.
All right, I see. So it can potentially violate Article 14 of Constitution in terms of freedom of residence. Now, Professor Song, some have also raised the issue of double punishment, as those who already served in prison might consider the residence restriction as another form of punishment. Is there a possibility that sex offenders could file a petition asking the Constitutional Court for a review? And if that happens, what would happen?
Well, I think they do have a pretty good argument on this issue because it seems like it's a different form of incarceration when they come out, and if they are forced to live in one area, and that potentially will cut off his contact with even the families. So there's a serious issue about the right to travel and freedom of association. But I think the minister was saying that this can be a result because these offenders will be in probation anyways. So under the probationary requirements, if they have to be monitored, if there are violations of those the requirements, then they can be put away. And one of the ways would be put into a designated area. However, I think that as Professor Lee mentioned, there are cases like California, but California tends to be liberal states anyway. So in the tougher states, the Supreme Court or the highest court may come down with very different results, preferring to favor the state's duty to protect the society. So I think there is a good argument for a constitutionality of this. They'll fight out, but I think it would depend on a number of the points. For example, whether they are given a choice to live in those or they're forced. If they have severe restrictions, for example, if they have to be home by 9 p.m. every night, probably that would be too severe. But if their living arrangements is such that under the circumstances that we have in a kind of a limited land spaces in Korea, probably that could come into a consideration in judging the constitutionality.
All right.
But I think that there will be a good fight on this.
Right, I agree. Now, Professor, so one more question. The draft would also have to go through the issue of designating specific areas for facilities to house sex offenders with a high risk of recidivism. And as nobody would happily accept the idea of having such a facility near them, it will be very difficult for the government to select a place. What is your view on this?
Well, this would be a NIMBY in a very extreme case. Right? I think that the community would be up in arms about housing this kind of facilities. And also, will be a case where they'll be spending taxpayers' money to house them and providing this kind of case. But I think that the fight come down to if we don't have this kind of arrangements, then the communities will have to be vigilant about those convicts coming into their areas, take a residence, but without the level of monitoring or the guidance from the state. So it's their choice. Sometimes it's better to have a designated area that everybody knows that they are there and they'll be monitored, and the state has the responsibility of patrolling them, rather than saying that, well, we run the risk of somebody coming into the community without any restrictions. So I think this would be a very big awareness and the promotion issue as well, and it has to be communicated and debated. But I think that it comes down to what kind of benefits the society gets by having those facilities near their home, because obviously their property value will be affected.
All right, I see your point. Well, Professor Lee, so up till now we have been talking about many concerns that have been raised regarding this law, but already other countries have such a law, for example, the United States, as we have already mentioned. What is the situation like abroad?
Right, so many countries around the world do have specific sex offender laws, and most of them are in relationship to, for example, registering with local authorities, as well as giving community notification that you are indeed a sex offender. And that's relatively common in many developed countries around the world today. But as we've been talking about in this discussion, the big issues related to sex offenders is, again, they have individual human rights, even though they are convicts, but also because of the high chance of recidivism, which the science has apparently proven that sex offenders, particularly of a certain kind, are prone to do the crime again over and over again without stopping, because for whatever reason they have a real problem with this really serious issue. And so the public certainly has an interest to make sure that their children are protected against such offenders. And so the courts around the world, particularly in the European context, have really examined this issue on different levels. And so particularly I'm thinking of here the European Court of Human Rights has addressed this issue from a number of states. And I mentioned here that the United Kingdom has such rules that include notification requirements as well as reporting requirements. And in such cases, really the question is proportionality, right? So you have to think about, as we've been talking about, the balance between the interests of the public and protection, and the state's interest to do that for its people versus the individual rights of those who are subject to these rules. And so the balance here, and depending on the jurisdiction, whether in Europe or in the United States or another country, is they use different legal standards to identify what's the appropriate balance to be made. And so in the European context, a lot of these rules have been upheld because the interests of the public outweighed, in this particular case, the individual rights of the convict because of the high chance of committing these crimes again. And so I think the general trend has been across the board. While Professor Song mentioned that California is a very progressive state, certainly many states have sort of really held fast to these rules and have upheld them within their constitutions.
All right, I see your point, Professor Lee. Now, we are running out of time, but I'd like to ask this last question quite briefly to our Professor Song. So such a discussion, is basically to contain repeat sex offenses. Could you give us any suggestions to make this stricter regulation even more effective?
Well, I think that in the outset they said there are many ingredients, like the chemical castration, the restrictions, but I think it has to start with the tougher sentences and the parole control. Then send a message that this is a serious crime, that you should not do these acts. Mm-hmm. And after that, because some of the sexual offenders have the medical condition that they cannot control, so I think there has to be a wholesome approach where if they need the chemical castration, they should. If they need the living arrangements, I think that should be an option. But with the tougher restrictions, tougher sentences, I think you can give them a choice to take these, so that you can take away a lot of the constitutional problems with this and make a kind of a set of ingredients to make it a good recipe rather than going out of balance in one or the other areas.
I cannot agree more. Professor Song, thank you for your advice. And unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's edition. Thank you, Professor Lee and Professor Song, for your time and insights. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, that's all for Within the Frame tonight. We'll be back tomorrow with more in-depth stories. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.